Martijn, Nicole, and I will be talking on behalf of many about next steps for evidence dissemination, and then I'm going to kick us off here. So, so first, I want to highlight what I see as kind of one of the biggest opportunities that we have as a community, which is figuring out how we collaborate towards scaling evidence. And I'll assert that still it is the current reality that the status quo is that our research paradigm involves one researcher from one institution asking one question about one exposure and one outcome, using one design on one database to generate one result, disseminating it through one publication, and communicating it to one audience. And I think it's this very structure which is highly suboptimal, both in terms of the quality of the evidence that's generated, but also in terms of how we could be doing so much more to scale what the possibilities are. And so I'd like to propose a future reality that actually involved a community of thousands of individuals from many different institutions answering an array of questions about all exposures of interest and all outcomes, applying some sort of standardized framework that incorporates multiple different designs across a network of hundreds of databases, generating millions of results disseminated across multiple channels to maximize the reach and the impact across stakeholders. And so this juxtaposition of what I'd assert is largely the status quo versus this future reality of where we could get is really one of the things that we tried to highlight at this year's OHDSI Global Symposium through the work that we did through the Legend Type 2 Diabetes study, as well as our partnership with Jack, and what I tried to highlight as part of our closing talk. One of the things that we only briefly touched on at the symposium that is covered in our Journey book, though. I wouldn't have expected everybody to read it, but every year George and I take the opportunity to try to just provide some reflections on the community. And in there, one of the things that we reflected on was that we've now celebrated 10 years as a community, starting back in December 2013. We've now completed a full decade of time. And in my closing letter in the Our Journey book, I highlighted one thing that I thought was actually somewhat fun and interesting, which was that at the very onset, we wrote down an initial vision of the OHDSI community, which was that OHDSI collaborators will access a network of 1 billion patients to generate evidence about all aspects of healthcare, and that patients and clinicians and other decision makers around the world will use OHDSI tools and evidence every day. And when we initially specified this vision, we thought that was bold and audacious, but something worth trying to target. And indeed, in that very first OHDSI publication that George is the lead author of in MedInfo, you can actually find this initial vision. And it was actually within 1 year that with our community, we actually revised our vision. And our current vision that you can even see on our website right now is a world in which observational research produces a comprehensive understanding of health and disease. And while I fully support our current vision and think that that's useful, I think it's potentially interesting for some on the call who don't know all of the backstory to realize that why did we change our vision? And specifically, it was because members of our community thought that the first vision was too bold and outlandish and something that wouldn't possibly be attainable, which was the reason why we actually changed it to not necessarily have a commitment. And yet, if we reflect on where we are 10 years from now, we now have a network of almost 1 billion patients. We have generated evidence about nearly all aspects of healthcare, and we do see that decision makers are using OHDSI tools and evidence nearly every day. And so, given that we've come so far as a decade, it is useful to reflect on where we could go in the next decade together. And if we're thinking about, a journey of 10 years, it's kind of fun to think about where could we be as a community in 2035. And so, not to relive the same failed experiment of us proposing a vision only to have members of the community react and reject that it is too crazy and bold and audacious. In the Our Journey book, I highlighted some predictions about where we could be in 2035. And so with thanks to Dima, who saw some of these predictions and thought that Patrick was off his rocker, we're going to do a quick exercise for about 10 minutes. I'm going to ask you all to participate. I'm going to put up the predictions of things we could accomplish together in the next decade and ask you to actually vote about how well you agree or disagree with those. So I'm going to ask you to go to polleverywhere.com/PatrickRyan800. I'm actually going to just flip over to the screen to get there. and put it on the screen. So Craig's just pasted in the chat that you can get there. It's polev.com/PatrickRyan800, or right now on your screen, you should be able to see the QR code. And I'm going to go through the predictions in our book and ask that you vote on how much do you agree that by 2034 we will achieve the following predictions. And you can basically strongly disagree, neither agree or disagree, agree or strongly agree. So our first statement here is that in 2034, OHDSI's open science community approach to evidence generation becomes the expected behavior across stakeholders and disciplines to promote innovation, reproducibility, and collaboration. And I'll give you guys a few seconds for the first one here to click on and vote. I'd love for you to answer honestly and give us a sense, because some of these things, I know at least Dima thinks I'm off my rocker for some of these, and that's totally okay. It's worthwhile to throw out some predictions, and not all of them are going to be right, as some of us learned in the last 10 days. Okay, so we've got, looks like a good number of people were able to vote on this one. So I'm going to go rapid fire through the other predictions in the book to get your input, and we're going to use this as foundation for talking about evidence dissemination. So next question. How much do you agree with the following statement? The OMOP Common Data Model will evolve and become recognized as the preferred international data standard for real-world evidence generation, will be seamlessly interoperable with complementary clinical data exchange standards, and will be consistently adopted across academia, industry, and government around the world. Right? Seeing some agreement, some disagreement, some neutrals. Give you 5 seconds on that one. All right, good. I'm going to look back at the results after we're all done here, but for now, making sure that you guys get a chance to vote. I'm going to go on to number 3. The number of unique data sources adopting the OMOP Common Data Model will exceed 50,000, but organizations will also use the CDM as a mechanism to partner to address cross-organizational data linkage and participatory patient self-reporting. This will increase the completeness and longitudinal continuity of patient records, enable connections across familial generations, and improve the fitness for use for each integrated source across a broader set of analytic use cases. And I see Philip agrees that there's some wild ones in here, and Melanie's highlighting that we've loaded a lot into these predictions. So take it as you may. All right, so we've got a kind of an even distribution on this one. All right, still a little bit of jockeying around here. All right, I'm going to go on to the next one. Prediction number 4 here. The OHDSI standardized vocabularies will provide the singular resource that maps all source terminologies and unstructured medical text into a common reference ontology with real-time updating to reflect the current state of knowledge in medicine. Sure you guys all can vote at polev.com/PatrickRyan800. Love to hear input from you guys to see what predictions or things that are something we can agree to and try to push forward, which ones may be a little bit too extreme. And it's good that we've got folks that are strongly supportive and strongly disagreeing, because then it probably means we've met some sort of sweet spot in terms of thinking about big ideas. All right. Thank you for that. We're going to go on to number 5. How much do you agree with by 2034 that every organization collecting patient-level data during routine course of clinical care will have established systems to standardize data to the OMOP Common Data Model using the latest OHDSI standardized vocabularies on a nightly basis, enabling daily reporting for disease surveillance and quality improvement? Christoph made a comment about the vocabulary being singular. I don't think that means that there's only one standard, but rather that it is a singular resource that we could be using. And Andrew is commenting that this is probably not a an unbiased representation, nor would the selection bias associated with doing this on an Odyssey community call be considered a scientific experiment. But it's good to see where the communities wants to be here. All right, that's slowed down, so thank you for that one. We got a lot of disagreement on that one. Go to number 6. How much do you agree that the Odyssey community will prove that real-world evidence from real-world data, when adhering to Odyssey's best practices and passing all objective diagnostics, can be considered just as reliable as evidence from randomized clinical trials? And open source systems that follow these practices will become trusted by health systems, payers, and regulators for guiding clinical care and policy decisions. I enjoy that we have multiple people that strongly agree and multiple people that strongly disagree. That's good to see diversity in our community. All right, next prediction. How much do you agree that advances in Odyssey's open source analytic platform will decrease the time to generate reliable real-world evidence across the Odyssey distributed network, and this process will be measured in minutes, not months? All right, let me go to the next one. How much do you agree that the Odyssey Evidence Network will make it both commonplace and expected to see hundreds of databases representing hundreds of millions of patients be represented in network studies of every important public health question? And this will ensure that evidence we generate is replicable within similar populations and generalizable to patients across North and South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia. Still seeing some bebopping around, but it seems like we got a majority that are in agreement about that, so that's nice to see. All right, going to go to the next one. How much do you agree that the Odyssey community will represent and support all clinical subspecialties and will become the primary source of real-world evidence to proactively fill evidence gaps needed to inform clinical guidelines around the management of every disease? All right, starting to slow down there. So I'll go to the all right, this one here, number 10. How much do you agree that by 2034, the Odyssey community will design, implement, and deliver results for more than 10,000 network studies, with the majority of research questions coming directly from patients and clinicians seeking reliable evidence to address their needs at the point of care? All right, we've got some relatively optimistic folks in the community. That's good to see. All right, the next one. Our next prediction is that discoveries across the Odyssey network about unrecognized effects of existing medical interventions will yield new indications that achieve regulatory approval due to the robustness of the real-world evidence produced within our community. I think we're going to get an approved new indication based on our Odyssey community. We got a decent number of folks think it's possible. All right. slowing down, so I'm going to go to the next question. Number 12. OHDSI will freely disseminate its evidence through more than 100,000 scholarly publications, but it'll also establish new modalities for evidence dissemination to more directly support clinical practice. Christoph's asking, is this cumulative? Yes, cumulative. We do not necessarily have to publish 100,000 papers every year, though I very much appreciate the question. And we're going to come back to this one throughout the rest of this session. So it's good to see we have some agreement, some dissension, some neutral folks, because we'll definitely think about how do we go from 730 papers that we have now as a community to 100,000 in the decade. All right, number 13. How much do you agree that by 2013, every disease will have a comprehensive real-world evidence summary that characterizes natural history and treatment pathways across the globe so that we can understand patient heterogeneity, promote health equity, and recognize unmet medical needs? Christoph highlights that there are diseases where with n equals 1, and those make calculating proportions very easy. And Hayden's mentioning that 100,000 submissions might actually be an issue for journals, which I think is explicitly one of the things we will be talking about in just a little bit. All right, so this one's we got quite a good amount of dispersion on how much we're going to be able to do to support natural history of diseases. Let's go to number 14. All right, and by 2034, every medical product will have a comprehensive real-world evidence surveillance summary from OHDSI that provides characterization of the incidence of all outcomes, population-level estimation of the causally attributable risk of each outcome and comparative effectiveness with all alternative treatments, and patient-level prediction models so that individuals can accurately determine their personalized risk given their medical history. And now Dima's thinking that these don't sound crazy at all after he specifically called me out as coming up with some far-flung ideas. So maybe they just maybe they don't sound as crazy now because you've let the crazy sink in. All right. All right. So it looks like we slowed down. And then the last but not least here, how much do you agree that by 2034, OHDSI evidence repositories will become the primary source of knowledge underpinning foundational models to promote better health decisions and better care? All right, seeing a dispersion of results here as well, but also many folks that do agree with these ideas. All right, well, I'll leave that last one open. I'm going to flip back to my slides here. Thank you for humoring me on that. Let's go here. All right, so I wanted to share those predictions with you because I think that as a community, we need to be thinking big about what the opportunity is in front of us as a community and what we can achieve, not if we're working by ourselves and thinking narrowly of what we're doing in the next month, but what we can be doing if we're thinking about how we work together as a community of thousands and what we can do if we actually start to develop infrastructure. Now, looking at the list of people that are on this call, many of the names are friendly faces that I know attended the OHDSI Global Symposium. For those who didn't, in the closing talk, one of the things that we tried to introduce was how we as a community are moving towards formalizing the process of not just generating evidence, but also thinking about how we interpret study reliability and ultimately interpret study results. And all of you who were in the room received a one-page piece of paper that we called our Legend Type 2 Diabetes Evidence Dissemination Summary. And this piece of paper was given to you as an exercise so that we could go through the process of evaluating study diagnostics for each of our databases who participated in the network, to evaluate meta-analytic diagnostics, and ultimately for us to try to develop a shared understanding of how to interpret the final composite effect estimate that came from our meta-analysis from all those databases that passed diagnostics. And we provided information both on the incidence of how often an outcome happens, as well as a population level effect estimate to allow us to directly answer the questions of causal inference. And so in 2022, when Martijn presented this idea that one process that we could follow is a pre-specification of a systematic approach, he highlighted this idea that in the future, we'd like to be able to pre-specify not just how to standardize asking research questions, not just standardizing the process of evidence generation, not just standardizing the way in which we interpret to define study reliability, but also how we actually interpret study results. And during the closing talk, we tried to go through and show that this could be something that all of us could do in a consistent manner. Specifically, I tried to introduce a framework that several of us have been working on just to think about interpreting results that rely on first defining what do we mean by quality of a study, with multiple dimensions there in terms of study design, transparency, and the diversity of data used within a study, with the idea that there can be a continuum whereby a high quality study that takes advantage of multiple designs to evaluate robustness, multiple analyses, and using pre-specified objective diagnostics with a pre-specified protocol, making all analysis code freely available and making all results available from a diverse collection of data sources really could be an aspiration that all studies could have if we want to have the highest quality studies. But what we also talked about is that once you have a study of a given quality, you can then think about the strength of evidence. And this can be on a continuum from none of the studies have actually satisfied diagnostics, or maybe just one database produces diagnostics, but we can also have strong evidence when we have lots of different databases passing diagnostics, few failing, and then providing us a robust collection of information. On the basis of that, we can assess the certainty of the estimate and the size of the effect as a mechanism for us to interpret how to read an estimation study in a consistent manner that we have. And so specifically, for those that were there, you all had this piece of paper. Hopefully you all still have it on your desk, because we specifically went through an exercise of helping you to think about how to interpret a given study. Each of you in the room, all 500 of you, was given a specific target comparator outcome analysis, and we went through evaluating quality of the study, strength of evidence, the certainty of the estimate, and the size of the effect as a part of the exercise. And specifically on that sheet, we walked through how to interpret database diagnostics as a standard output. We talked about meta-analytic diagnostics as something that we can add on to the robustness of our studies. And then we specifically spent time talking about how to interpret that final result and not being just a slave to the legacy of a p less than 0.05. At the very end of my closing talk, though, I put up this slide, and I heard after I gave this talk that many people didn't believe me. So I'm going to state this closing slide again. I stated that all 500 of you that were in the room, most of you had in your hand a piece of reliable evidence that could be published and can make a difference. I told you all that you all have permission to disseminate that evidence and explicit encouragement from the Legend leadership and the OHDSI community to do so. We simply just ask that you coordinate with the Legend team and stick to our OHDSI authorship guidelines. So Mark and the Legend team have lots of papers that are underway, but all of the papers all of the results that we handed out are not papers that are currently being written, except if you all can contribute and be part of the Legend team to get that evidence out there. And we also called back to the fact that this is not a task that you need to do alone. One of our earlier exercises at the symposium was to have you make your own dream teams of people who have the right compilation of skills and capabilities to put together papers themselves. And so with this in mind, I want to reinforce and encourage all of you that this is something that you can and should be thinking about doing if you're interested. We want you to be doing this. But one thing that I heard from at least a couple people was, okay, you gave me results, but I still have to write a paper or figure out the dissemination mechanism, and that still seems hard. And so one of the things we're going to spend the rest of the time in this meeting on, Martijn and Nicole are going to talk about how we as a community can think about how to improve that process beyond now standardizing the question, the evidence, the study reliability, and the estimates, is to think about how can we also move forward as a community towards dissemination. And so actually I think Martijn, I'll flip over to you now if you want.
Sure. Oh, I thought you had one more slide.
You want to do this one? Okay, so I'll just highlight as one last callback to the symposium. At the symposium, we had a great session with Harlan, Chan, and Yuen talking about our OHDSI partnership with JAC. I'll just highlight that in JAC, there is an explicit call for publications of original research, and Harlan actually writes the specific things that let's not get worried about formatting when you're initially submitting evidence, just make sure that the evidence is reliable. But as a general parameters, what JAC asks for and what pretty much all clinical journals ask for is some sort of paper that's going to have some sort of abstract that's of a smaller number of words, and then a body of an abstract that generally contains a background section, methods, results. Results usually contain some set of tables and figures, and then conclusions. And most journals now are enabling to provide other supporting information that may not fit in the boundaries and purviews of the paper. And so given that you heard from Harlan, those are the symposium of, the desire to see OHDSI community members submitting papers to JAC, I was strongly wanting to encourage that as one possible venue. But even still, there's an open question of how do we actually write sections of background, methods, results, conclusions as a community following best practices? And so Martijn, I'll turn it over to you to guide the community through thinking about that.
Thank you, Patrick. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yep.
All right, cool. Yeah, so looking back over the past 10 years of OHDSI, it strikes me that we actually achieved something quite significant in that we've been able to vastly reduce the time that it takes to perform an observational study. And this has gone from months or even sometimes years to do a study to days. But at the same time, we have vastly increased the reliability of those observational studies. So it's certainly not the case that quicker means dirtier, quite the opposite. We've been able to raise the bar quite a lot through our standardized analytics, objective diagnostics, and by generating evidence at scale. And so in the past, and actually still the status quo for most research groups is that a study looks like this. You need about 3 months to write a protocol, 3 months to then implement the study, because you start, of course, with a blank SAS script, and then you take 3 months to execute the study, and then you realize you have to do some post-hoc analyses, and then you have 3 months or something to write the paper. And now with OHDSI, it is actually possible to do the first part. Generating the evidence can take as little as 2 weeks. By 1 week to design your study and 1 week to execute the study and then read the unblinded results. And I know that many of the people on the call are not yet at this level of proficiency with the OHDSI tools, but there certainly are groups that are, like our group at J&J, that are able to achieve this. But then we still need to write a paper, and that still takes 3 months, and everybody who's ever written a paper knows that that is actually a very optimistic number. It usually takes longer than that. Now we're in this situation where, oddly enough, writing the paper takes the vast majority of the time, even though the evidence, the thing that really is the important thing, has already been generated. And so an open question is, well, what can we do about it? Can we open up this box that is now taking so much of our time and see if there are any opportunities to make this more efficient? So what's in a scientific paper? Well, this should not be news to any of you, but we have our background section that goes into what was the question that we sought to answer, why is the question and its answer important, and what is already known about the question. and any answers that might be out there. Then we go into our methods, what data were used, how were exposures and outcomes defined, what statistical analysis was performed, and of course, in an OHDSI study, we would then talk about the objective diagnostics that we pre-specified. The results would enumerate which analyses passed which diagnostics and what were the results that actually passed diagnostics. And then the discussion would be a recap of what we've learned and then how does that fit with what we already knew. So some sort of a synthesis. Now the methods and results section, as you've all learned probably at school, should be objective descriptions of what was done and what was observed. So it should ideally be no personal subjective interpretation. Combine that with the use of standardized analytics like we do in OHDSI, where we have standardized analysis specifications and standardized outputs. These two sections basically become a fill in the blanks exercise that we could largely automate. And we actually showed you a proof of concept of this quite a few years ago. I don't know if you all were there, but when we demonstrated the legend hypertension results, we also showed this gimmick called Legend Met Central. What it did is would use R Markdown to convert the legend hypertension results to draft papers. And as a user, you basically have to select a target comparator outcome database combination, and then it would generate a PDF for you. Legend Met Central is still alive, but it's a bit buggy, but it can still generate these PDFs. If you go to data.ohdsi.org/Legend Met Central, you can use it right now. And I'm going to show you here one of the generated papers. And as you can see, certainly the formatting looks very nice. Thank you, Mark. And it has like all the components that one would expect in a paper, including like attrition diagrams and diagnostics and whatnot. If we dive into what we had in the methods section of Legend Met Central, then you see here that we had a description of the data source, which was just pulled from a database where we had descriptions for each one of the databases. We cheekily just referred to the protocol for exposure and outcome definitions, where they actually were already provided. Since it was a legend study, the study design was fixed. So we actually could just use standard text. We didn't have to make that dynamic. And at the time when we did this, we hadn't yet thought of the idea of objective diagnostics. So we didn't mention those here in the method section. Now, if you're using OHDSI tools, then you have OHDSI core definitions. Those are actually can easily be converted to human readable text. So we could actually include those in, or at least a supplement, maybe not the main body of the paper. And even if you allow for a more flexible study design, then since we're using standardized analytics, we could actually just basically have this text on the study design be dynamically generated based on the choices that were made. So this actually is still something we could pick up and move forward with our making it compatible with our current best practices. Similarly, the results section was pre-generated. In this case, we pulled figures and tables from the results database. For example, we had a standard set of results artifacts. For example, we had a standard table 1 with patient characteristics. Mark even included some simple logic to modify the text in the results section. So, for example, if the standard difference of means, the balance metric after propensity score matching was greater than 0.1, then the text would just state that that was the case. As one example. However, at that time, we did not use blinding when diagnostics failed. So we showed all results, even when now in hindsight, we would say you shouldn't. Nowadays, we just do that differently. We'd review all the diagnostics and then only unblind results where appropriate. And actually, the one pager that you all got at the OHDSI Symposium at the closing ceremony, that's actually, I think, a very good starting point for a new results section that we could write, or a template for a new results section. So I think methods and results, we actually can have a very good first draft of that by following this fill-in-the-blank approach. But what about other sections? So let's think about the background section. So the background section is primarily a synthesis of the context of the research question. And synthesizing is actually something that was not something you could think you could do 10 years ago, but certainly something that is feasible nowadays with large language models. And so we have a proof of concept background writer that I called Clio. I'm here showing you how it works. I'm not going to go into detail here, just to point out that it's not as simple as just asking ChatGPT to draft your background section. That doesn't work. But it seems to be possible to have quite a good first draft of your background section with a dedicated generative AI solution. So this proof of concept suggests that it's feasible, but it's well, first of all, needs a thorough evaluation. So currently, it's primarily me saying that the draft background sections look good, but we need a formal evaluation. I started by comparing it with PubMed Central background sections, but that showed actually that there's just a large variability in background section. That doesn't mean that one is worse or better than another. So in the end, we'll probably require some human review where the OHDSI community could certainly help. Furthermore, several methodological questions remain very much open. In this background section writer, should we pull in full text articles, and other questions need to be investigated before we can proceed. And last but not least, LLMs are actually quite expensive to use, so it's not obvious how we could make this available to the community without incurring a cost that we could not pay. Anyway, so concluding, writing papers has become the bottleneck in generating and disseminating evidence in OHDSI. As I try to highlight, I think there are opportunities where we can increase the efficiency. Specifically, the methods and results section, we could create templates that are filled in with our analysis specifications and results. And for the background section, there's hope that generative AI could help there, but we definitely need more research by the OHDSI community. And so I think those are great opportunities for the OHDSI community. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Nicole.
Thanks, everyone. So that's been a really good overview of where we're at right now in terms of evidence dissemination. And one of the things, obviously, that we as a community need to do is disseminate that evidence, but also translate that evidence into clinical practice if we're really to fulfill this mission that we have in OHDSI. So I wanted to take this opportunity to advertise the evidence translation work group that we're trying to start as part of the OHDSI community. So I'm just going to show you kind of where this came from. So if we flash back to the APAC symposium we had back in 2023 in Australia, we kind of use this analogy of the beer brewing process, quite obviously. And at that time, we were thinking, well, our ingredients are data, our craft is science, and our brew is evidence. So we're creating evidence, and we're, wanting that evidence to be consumed. And our duty is now to share that beer. So Mark, at the start of 2024, gave us this great quote, and he said that we have objectively failed on our next step of providing this evidence to the greater community. But as you've seen, we've made a lot of progress in that area. So how can OHDSI improve the use and uptake of real-world evidence so that it produces actionable evidence? One of the ways I think we can do that is to make it consumable to different parts of, different stakeholders. So consumers and clinicians, regulators and researchers. So we all need to work together, be on the same table to make this evidence that we produce actionable. Oops, not working. That's better. So at that APAC symposium, we had this really nice panel discussion where we brought together different stakeholders. So we actually had a regulator on the panel from the TGA in Australia. We had clinician, we had a consumer representative, and of course we had researchers. And if anybody wants to look at that recording, it's a really interesting discussion we had looking at how we can disseminate the evidence of the SOS challenge fluoroquinolone study. So the QR code is there if anybody wants to look at that recording. But the sorts of things we asked there is, well, how do we get evidence to be consumed? Well, we need to answer the questions that matter. So we talked about that with the regulators and the clinicians. So what matters to you? If something matters to somebody, they're more likely to engage and use that evidence. So how can we as the OHDSI community start to work together with the people who want to use our evidence so that we can deliver it to them to answer the questions that are important to them? We also talked about, building trust to help make that evidence consumable, and we've done a lot of that with the objective diagnostics, of course. So we're kind of in a good place with the building trust. We now just need them to use it. And then the last part was really about how do we improve the understanding of the real world evidence. So how do we package it up? And Martijn just talked about how we could do that in a publication, but there are other ways that we can get this evidence out there. And I think we need to think a bit more broadly about the types of ways we can do that, whether we do lay summaries or impact stories or blogs or social media posts or websites that can actually, provide that evidence in a user-friendly and interpretable kind of way for people. So that's really how the evidence translation work group proposal sort of came about. So we're really looking for people to be involved in this collaboration and to help set the OKRs and set up some sort of discussion around how we do this evidence translation. So I haven't got time to go through all of this, but just to say that there is a lot of, obviously a lot of research into this whole process of knowledge translation. And there's lots of different ways of, packaging it up and creating a framework for knowledge to action dissemination. So if you do a Google search, there are 1,000 different ways and structures and processes that people use to do this kind of knowledge translation. But the idea is really that we've created our knowledge, and we do that really well in OHDSI. We have this knowledge that we've created. We've synthesized it and we've produced products and tools to, summarize that evidence. But what we really need to do is sort of develop this framework around that to get that knowledge into action. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. This is a really nice framework, that the Cochrane Knowledge Translation Framework, and it really sort of highlights what we're doing here in OHDSI, like producing the evidence, making that evidence accessible, so creating packages to push that out, but also to facilitate the pull of it, so to generate interest in actually engaging with that evidence. And then there's other goals, longer term goals, like advocating for that evidence and then creating an effective and sustainable knowledge generation framework, knowledge translation framework. So here are just my first little goes at doing the OKRs. We won't go through them, but I really would love people to come to the knowledge translation work group to really think through these processes and help try to create these goals and how we're going to facilitate the translation of this knowledge. So next steps is we're going to set up a channel for the work group, and that's already there. We just need people to sign up. So I've asked Craig to put that on the list of sign-ups on the OHDSI website. and then we'll set up a schedule of meetings and work out our OKRs. So I'll leave it there, and we've got 5 minutes for discussion. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Patrick, Martijn, and Nicole for certainly a thought-provoking and excellent session. We do have 5 minutes, so Andrew, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hugely impressed with everything you reviewed from the history of Odyssey and how you're taking it forward. It's just exciting as heck. And I'm going to raise a question I think is central, and it's don't take it as like negative. I think one of the challenges of making stuff actionable and appealing is to not only generate a massive amount of evidence and put it in context, but to integrate it with the other information that's known. Where you think about like peeling a piece of something was done as part of a legend study, each one of those things kind of needs to be in the context of other relevant studies. Like the entire set of analyses that are done, it's hard to even conceive of how you do a literature review and sort of grade the existing prior evidence outside of Odyssey that's relevant to that. So that seems like a challenge, like making this all pay off in a way is how do you integrate those results, either singly or collectively, with the prior evidence in some way? And is that a part of what this group is going to be taking on, or is that down the road?
Martijn, you want to start?
Yeah. Yeah, so Patrick and I actually had a very similar discussion to what you were just saying, Andrew, where at first I was very dismissive, like, yes, somebody should integrate all this, but no, it shouldn't be us because we're the observational health data science and informatics. But if it's not us, then who will do that? So I'm sort of shifting my position and thinking, well, maybe we should move into this space where we actually integrate evidence across all sorts of sources. So other real world evidence, but also trials or just literature, established medical knowledge. So that's certainly something that we're thinking about, but it's a big challenge.
I'll just say real quickly, there's Cochrane and others there's AI as applied to evidence synthesis tasks and evidence to kind of help standardize ways in which quality of evidence and similarity of results are aggregated algorithmically from the published literature are a thing and probably lend themselves to whatever approach gets taken. So there's just points of contact. We're a Cochrane site. We have some contact with some of those efforts. It just seems like maybe there are places where different groups meet whatever it is Odyssey does that can be leveraged.
Yeah, I think your comment there, Andrew, is spot on in terms of where we as a community need to go. If we are generating actionable information, we can think of it from a Bayesian perspective. There's some prior knowledge, we've contributed new knowledge, and on the basis of whatever the prior knowledge was and the new knowledge we've generated, there is some perspective of what we should believe now as a posterior that we can act on. And I think that for us as a community to make our evidence truly actionable is going to require us to be helping people understand what their new posterior probabilities actually are. And that's going to require a synthesis of what's already out there. I do think, though, we need to be mindful of the current reality of like evidence is all over the place and it's a mess and people can't even put it together and be mindful of like that's like where we're all living today, but also looking towards a vision of like what should the world look like in let's say 2034. And my assertion is it would be really awful for humanity if in 2034 the answer to when a patient asks a doctor a question about like should I take drug A or drug B for my disease, if that doctor is looking up into a repository of PDF documents from PubMed and trying to make sense of a various set of articles, or worse yet, paying a multi-$1,000 license to UpToDate so that they can actually read somebody else's opinion about that topic. There's clearly has to be a fundamentally much better solution for humanity, and I think we are well positioned to help design and implement that solution.